Hi, my name is Rick Edgman. I'm here at Uppsala University from Utah State University in the US. So at Uppsala University, I'm a guest professor of quality sciences. In the US, I am at, again, Utah State University in the John M. Huntsman School of Business, where I'm a professor of management, but I'm also the research director for the Shingo Institute, where the Shingo Institute is a unit that administers the Shingo Prize, and the Shingo Prize is probably the world's premier prize for operational excellence. And we have more companies that win that prize or two of the sub prizes that come from places outside the US than we do from US companies, in fact. And then I also have a third appointment at Aarhus University in Denmark, where I'm a professor of sustainability and enterprise performance. So we're going to talk today just a little bit about supply chain risk management. And when we do that, you should be able at the end of this presentation to answer just a few questions or address a few issues. So first, why and how does risk occur, especially risk in supply chains? Second, what are some of the key sources of supply chain risk? What are some of the key approaches used in supply chain risk management? What are black swan events? How can we learn from those? Can we anticipate specific black swan events or not? And then, what are some of the major terrorist threats to supply chains? And I'm not even really going to be presenting you with terrorist threats to supply chains as much as asking you what those might be. So just to give you some preface to that as to why that interests me so much. So 9/11, the day that will live in history for many, during 9/11, I worked in the Washington, D.C. area, and it was common for me to go into my job at about 5 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning. It was about a 40-kilometer drive, and I did that so that I could beat the traffic and just not be tied up in traffic. Because at 5 or 5:30 in the morning, that was a 45-minute drive. At 6:30 in the morning, it was a 2-hour drive maybe. Add some rain, add some snow, it was a very long drive. And I'd come home later in the evening because later in the evening I could also have less traffic. So that particular day, though, on 9/11, for some reason, I didn't go into work at my normal early time. I went in a little bit later. And I wasn't listening to the radio. I hadn't seen any television beforehand. But as I approached where my job is, which was just outside of Washington, D.C. in suburban Maryland, I could see smoke rising from the Pentagon area. And I thought, well, that's curious. You can't see the Pentagon from where I was, but you know that it's there. But I just assumed that it was a fire of some sort. But then I got to where I worked, which at that time was at the University of Maryland, and very quickly the university was locked down. It was clear something had gone on. In fact, there was so much traffic on internet websites, standard newspaper, standard news outlets like abcnews.com or nbcnews.com in the US or usatoday.com and so on, that I could not get through to any of the common outlets. Eventually I thought, whatever is happening, probably if it's this big, that it's being covered by the Jerusalem Post. So I went to the jerusalempost.com and was able to find very quickly what had happened in New York, especially at the World Trade Center, and had happened only moments before at the Pentagon. So from the University of Maryland, we lost former students who were working in the World Trade Center in the Twin Towers. And we also lost students who were assigned to the Pentagon that were in the Navy. So it was actually something that hit pretty carefully. It hit in great depth where I was working and in the entire area, as you can imagine. Later, I ended up doing some significant work for the Office of the Chief Technology Officer for the government of Washington, D.C. So not the national government, but the government of Washington, D.C. itself. But Washington, D.C. is the seat of military power in the U.S. It's the seat of political power in the U.S. It's an information technology or a high-tech, strong high-tech area. And, of course, it's also a financial region that is very important in the U.S. and globally. So imagine what could happen if a terrorist attack could take down the information technology system just for the government of Washington, D.C. itself. Massive things. At that time, there were about 70 to 72 agencies in Washington, D.C. that had some integrated information technology systems. So the Office of the Chief Technology Officer worked with me, and what the task was to be able to reduce the vulnerability of the information technology for the government of DC. We did that using quality management techniques called Six Sigma techniques, and so on. Now, there was monetary savings for them in that, but that wasn't really the chief motivation. The chief motivation was instead to reduce the amount of risk they had in their information technology systems, especially to things like attacks. Okay? So I have an extreme interest in terrorist threats, and you can see that that's part of the motivation for that. So think about terrorist threats to supply chains, because they are real and they have happened. And then just kind of throw that around in your mind and see what you might be thinking about. Okay, there are a lot of supply chain risk causes. These are just it's a partial list that you'll see on this particular slide. Just-in-time, or JIT, is one of them. Just-in-time manufacturing, for example, would say that we don't want to have a lot of inventory sitting around in our plants. Inventory, the quality of what's in the inventory erodes or degrades over time. So we don't want it for that reason. It takes up space, which leaves us less space where we can be doing actual work. It makes things less safe, believe it or not, because things are more congested. It's easier to trip or have some sort of safety accident. So JIT, that's a problem for some. It's also really, really critical to the way that business is done in places like Japan or other companies that have followed their lead in lean manufacturing. But if you're not really good at it, it can pose particular threats. So just-in-time inventory. Outsourcing, because anytime you outsource something, what that means is that you're giving up some control. Supply base reduction, if you're using fewer suppliers, then you're more vulnerable in your supply chain if something happens significant to any one of those suppliers. Centralized distribution, if you're only distributing from one place, then what that means is if something occurs at that one place, then your distribution network is strongly disrupted. More and faster product launches, because with more and faster product launches, those pose particular problems. For example, that you're rushing something to market too quickly, and that there are alterations in it, and then you have to work with your suppliers more carefully, and you have to get more parts, and it's a more volatile market, and so forth. So there are some real risks that go along with that as well. Low-cost country sourcing, okay? Because low-cost countries tend to be more politically volatile. And anytime you have political volatility in a company, that can affect borders, it can affect shipping, it can affect so many different things. Depletion of natural resources, because with depletion of natural resources, what that means is that you may have to look for another source of something that previously was available to you. It may also mean that you have to look for some alternative material, let's say, that you haven't been using. It could mean that you have to look for different suppliers. It could mean that you're, with depleting natural resources, it could equally mean that you're going to be paying more for what you get, and so there's a lot of price volatility. So that's a threat. Okay. Still another threat would be something like lack of visibility, traceability, and transparency beyond your first-tier suppliers. You can see what they're doing, but what you can't see is what your suppliers' suppliers are doing, and your suppliers' suppliers are doing. So that lack of vision of what's happening can leave you partially blinded to the environment in which you're operating, the business environment in which you're operating. And certainly natural disasters. So consider, for example, the tsunami in Southeast Asia. That did a lot of things to a lot of businesses. It also, of course, hit the Fukushima power plants in Japan, caused a number of problems there. They still haven't recovered completely from that and won't for a very long time. They still don't have their power completely back online from that. So, and with lack of power come other disruptions. So these are just some of the common supply chain risks that you might think about. If we look at the Global Risk Report, the risks that are out there really depend in large measure to where you're at, because the political situation, the climate situation, and so on is very different depending on where you're at. So, for example, in North America, the major threats are things like cyber attacks. So as I'm recording this particular lecture, it is not long after the 2016 U.S. presidential election. And there were at least rumors of not necessarily cyber attack, but invasion into, let's say, the email server of Hillary Rodham Clinton, or into some of her chief supporters, chief staff. So those caused particular problems. Some people think that that partially influenced the U.S. election. Some people think it didn't influence the election at all, but that it was partly disruptive. So cyber attacks, failure of climate change adaptation, failure of critical infrastructure. Okay, so that is one of the things that, for example, President Trump will be addressing, or at least indicates that he will be addressing, is a rebuilding of critical infrastructure. In Europe, there are different risks. In Europe, it's more like large-scale involuntary migration. So for those of you that are in Europe, you know about some of the migration problems that you've had over the last few years, especially with all of the disruption in Syria and in that region. So something like profound social instability, or unemployment or underemployment. So the risks that are out there differ very much by the region of the world that you're in. But this is relatively recent as a result, or as a report. It's from 2015. And you can see what it's like in the area of the world that you happen to be in. So we identify usually a couple different types and levels of risk. One type is just a deviation. Deviation is just when one or more parameters stray from an expected value without any changes to the underlying supply chain structure. That's usually less serious than a disruption. Disruption is when you have the structure of the supply chain and it is radically transformed through the unavailability of certain facilities or certain suppliers or transportation options and so on. So you will see a little bit later in this presentation that happened when there was a problem at a valve company for valves in automobiles for Toyota. And over a 6-week period, that cost Toyota close to $2 billion US. That is a disruption. Disaster. Disaster is when a temporary, irrecoverable shutdown of the supply chain network occurs due to unforeseen, catastrophic, system-wide disruptions. Those can be caused, for example, by things like the tsunami that hit Southeast Asia. There are some important ideas, key approaches to improving your supply chain, its ability to address risk. Resiliency is one. So remember that we talked about a risk being when you had centralized distribution, only one place from which you distribute. Well, if you want to mitigate the risk that comes with that, then the natural thing to do would be not to have centralized distribution, but to have distributed networks, okay, where you went from several sites. Okay. Still another approach would be agility. Okay, you want to be more adaptable. You want to be more visibility of what you can see in the organization, changes that are going on with your suppliers, and political clarity and so on, and you want to be fast. Redundancy. Okay, redundancy, think of that as a backup. Right? It's a backup. It's when you have more than you need just in case you need it. Okay, more capacity, more inventory, more memory if you're talking about information technology, let's say, things of that sort. Having a second server just in case, for example. And relationships. So if you have strong relationships, a lot of times what that means is that if you have one supplier who has difficulties, you may be able to work with the second supplier with whom you have good relationships. Okay, there are risks in the supply chain when unexpected events might disrupt the flow of materials. So those risks could be internal, they could be external, they can appear any place in the supply chain, they can interrupt the supply of materials or product demand, they can cause sudden peaks or collapses in demand, they can certainly cause lots and lots of problems of different sorts. Anything from a minor delay to a natural disaster. Okay. They can have effects that range from minutes to permanent. Okay. Notice that it says effects. The disruption doesn't have to be permanent. It says the effects of the disruption can be temporary, brief, they could be permanent. For example, when they had a fire at a component supplier for Nokia, that came very close to destroying Nokia, taking it down as a company. So it can be localized one part of the supply chain, can be pervasive across the entire supply chain. And while most risks in truth are relatively minor, there are some that are quite large. So here's an example. 1997, so we're talking about almost 20 years ago, but it's a pretty famous example. So you had unexpected market conditions, and there was a clothing retailer named Next, and they had things go wrong in the stock. Okay, so when that happened, Next couldn't meet customer demand. What did that mean? It meant that they had a lot of unhappy customers, and when they had a lot of unhappy customers, then they had a dramatic drop in sales. And when they had a dramatic drop in sales, then they also lost a lot of their share price. So the value of the company was dramatically reduced. Not a supply chain issue, but I'll give you another example. So quite some time ago, there was a company called Storage Technology. And what Storage Technology made was massive memory, if you will. And I can't remember if they called it Ice Cube or Iceberg, but in any case, they had announced that a new memory device would come out. There was a lot of anticipation in the market for it. And when they didn't meet the release date, let's suppose it was February 15th of that year, when they couldn't meet that release date and they had to say, there's going to be a delay, their stock price fell dramatically. And they announced a second release date. And then they didn't make that one, and their stock price fell even more, much more. Now, Storage Technology actually was a pretty leading edge company. They just weren't meeting the announcement dates that they had set, and the value of the company declined just incredibly. What happened? Well, what happened is that when it got down to that low point after the second time that it couldn't make its scheduled delivery date, IBM bought Storage Technology, and Storage Technology you wouldn't recognize now as a separate company. Or any longer existing company. They were just integrated into IBM and gave IBM more capability than they had previously with respect to massive memory, massive storage. Here's an example, another one from supply chain. 2001, over-optimistic forecast encouraged Cisco to build up stock, inventory, if you will, so that they could meet customer demand, and then that customer demand never materialized. And so eventually that cost them $2.2 billion that they had to write off their stock. So, this is an example of thinking that there's a market for something that the market isn't there, or the market isn't as extreme as you thought. I could give you a small example of something like that. Most of you will be familiar with a company called Adidas, or maybe you call it Adidas. But in any case, early in the life of that company, they had a shoe designer, and that shoe designer came up with a design that they believed would be just massively successful. Now, this is when Adidas is a startup company. There wasn't a lot of capital there, okay, and they were at risk. They invested approximately $1 million in the development of that shoe. By today's standards, that $1 million would be nothing to Adidas, or it'd be trivial to Adidas. On the other hand, what happened was the shoe was developed and nobody wanted it. They developed a product for which there was no market. And early in the life of Adidas, that was almost a substantial enough loss to take that company out of existence. So it's really important to be able to even to forecast the sort of market that is out there, because by forecasting the market accurately, you can certainly plan your inventory needs, you can plan the needs that you have from your suppliers, and so on. Still another one. Toyota shut down, this is the one that I mentioned previously, Toyota shut down 20 out of its 40 assembly plants at one point in time for a total of 6 weeks. Why did they do that? They did that for exactly one reason, and it was a fire at one of their suppliers. So it was a supplier of valves, and when that supplier could no longer provide those valves, guess what? They had to shut down basically half of their production. 20 out of 40 assembly lines. 40 million US dollars a day in dollars of that time. 40 million times 42 days, 6 weeks times 7 days. It's about 1.6 billion US dollars. And then I would challenge you to find, because it's an easily found and it's a famous case, find the case of Ericsson versus Nokia in responses to basically a fire at one of their suppliers. The supplier was a Philips company. I want to say that it was in the U.S. state of Arizona, as I recall. And it was a chip manufacturer. Okay, that was the particular component that was being supplied. They had the fire. The Philips supplier couldn't provide for them what they needed. But Ericsson and Nokia addressed that in very different ways. So see if you can find that case. See what those two companies did differently, because Ericsson's response saved Ericsson. Nokia's response almost took them out of business at that time. So why does risk occur? Well, we may not be fully aware of, may not appropriately interpret what's already happened. Okay, that's part of it, is that we just misunderstand the history that has gone before us. And we may never completely know what's going to happen in the future. I mean, I'm sure that you could identify, if you think about it, even for a few minutes, an occasion or maybe a couple times when you've misinterpreted risk. So I know that I've certainly done that. And I could give you some famous examples, but I don't really want to embarrass myself that badly. So what is risk? Well, when we talk about risk, we usually distinguish between risk and uncertainty. And think about it in terms of two phrases. Risk is associated with known unknowns, and uncertainty is associated with unknown unknowns. So in risk, it means that we can list out the events that might happen in the future. That's why it's risk. It hasn't happened yet. Okay. Might happen in the future, and we can assign reasonably a probability to each of those different things that might happen. So those are the things that we call known unknowns. Uncertainty, on the other hand, means that we can list out the events that might happen in the future, but we don't have any idea about which are more or less likely to occur. Okay, in other words, we can't get a handle on the probability that different things occur. That would be pure speculation on our part. Well, those are unknowns. We don't know whether they're going to happen, and if they do, we don't know how likely it is. So that has some relation to what are called black swan events. So black swan theory, it used to be thought that black swans were essentially mythical, that black swans didn't really exist, and so people would talk about black swans to mean that it was something impossible. So if you made a statement and somebody would say, oh, that's a black swan, they would just be saying, no, that's impossible, that can't happen. As sort of an example, in 1997 and 98, I spent a year on leave from my U.S. university, and I was at a university in Denmark. One of my colleagues in Denmark was interested in coming to the U.S. a year or two later and spending a year. But then they had school-age children, and they saw that there had been I shouldn't even have to say it this way, a fairly small school shooting at one of the schools in the U.S. That was in early 1998, I think. At the time, I was living in Colorado. And so they were concerned. They had two school-age children, and their children would need to go to a school in the U.S. So they were concerned that, well, could that happen in Colorado? And I said, and I believed, that could never happen in Colorado. Well, I was wrong, because I think many of you will at least know the name of this school, Columbine. So I returned home, and in April of 1999, I want to say April 20th of 1999, we had the Columbine school shootings in Colorado, near Denver. And I think that most people were like me. Nobody believed that that could happen. And now, sometimes there are school shootings and people say, it's another Columbine. That's how famous it was. Nobody foresaw it, and yet it happened. And so when we talk about black swan events, it's a bit like that. So black swan theory is just sort of a metaphor, or a story, a comparison that describes an event that comes as a surprise. It has a major effect, and it's oftentimes inappropriately rationalized after it happens, which you can do because now you've seen it happen, so now you can start thinking about, oh, well, why did that happen? And so that theory, the black swan theory, is intended to explain a couple of different things. First, the disproportionate role of high-profile, hard-to-predict, and rare events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations in history, science, finance, technology. Second, the non-computability of a probability of the consequential rare events using scientific methods. It's never happened. How can I estimate the probability that it would happen? And third, the psychological biases that blind people, both individually and collectively, to uncertainty and to a rare event's massive role in historical affairs. So this was one. 1865, April 14th, United States, Washington, D.C., Ford's Theater. And a man named John Wilkes Booth came up behind President Abraham Lincoln in his theater box and shot him and killed him. Abraham Lincoln was rushed across the street to a private home where he died. Well, that event had enormous impact, not only on the U.S., but globally. Everybody knows Abraham Lincoln's name, even still. Everybody knows Abraham Lincoln as a champion for civil rights and so forth. So that event was a big and important event that almost changed U.S. history in other ways, because that event was just a few days. I want to say it was about a week after the end of the United States Civil War. And it was an act that was actually meant to forward the Confederate States of America, the people on the other side of the war that lost, who believed that the war wasn't really over, that they could do some things and they could still claim victory ultimately for their way of life. Well, they were wrong. Lincoln's death accomplished precisely the opposite. What are some of the black swan attributes? First, it is an outlier. Outlier means extreme. It is really extreme. So it's outside the realm of regular expectations because nothing in the past can convincingly point to the fact that it was going to occur. Second, it has a huge impact. Third, in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us make up explanations for its occurrence after the fact, making it explainable and predictable. So in other words, maybe after Columbine, I could come up with some explanation for why it happened and why it happened there. So what I didn't tell you is that when Columbine happened, I was teaching at Colorado State University, and additionally I was teaching down in Denver, Colorado, in what was called an executive MBA program for Colorado State. Those are normally more senior people. They're quote-unquote executives who are pursuing an executive education, usually to advance their career, sometimes just for personal growth. But some of the students in that particular class had children who were students at Columbine, and they would not even have known at that time whether their children were among the victims. I had a woman who was in one of my other classes who a few years earlier had been in one of my classes. She ended up dropping the course in the middle of a semester. She had been doing it very, very well, but she had a husband who was killed in a hunting accident, and it traumatized her and her young children, and she just couldn't continue in school at that time. Well, when Columbine happened, coincidentally, that woman was in the same class, although on the Colorado State University campus. She was in the same class, and she was going to drop out of school again and completely. She was performing exceptionally well again, because not that her children were directly affected by being at Columbine. Her children were still too young to be in the high school, but her children were at a nearby school where some of the kids from Columbine were evacuated to, and it re-traumatized the entire family. So Columbine had a profound effect on individual and collective levels. By the way, the course that I had in Denver that night was canceled for that night. Not by me, but by the university, because of everything that was happening at Columbine. I had a number of students on campus who had brothers or sisters at Columbine, who had attended Columbine themselves, who had nephews or friends, or not nephews or friends, but cousins or friends that were at Columbine and so on. Profound, profound effect. And it definitely got into the psyche of people, not just in Colorado, but around the nation. Even you may have known the name Columbine before I said it. Summary. With a fairly small number of black swan events, you can explain most of the big things that have happened in world history. So if you want to reference, there's a reference on the bottom of the page. Fascinating read. Worthwhile for you just in terms of personal growth and influencing your perspective. So how do we identify a black swan? Well, unfortunately, we don't identify them in advance because we don't recognize them until after they happen. But if we want to call something a black swan event, these would be the normal characteristics. 1, it was a big surprise to the observer. 2, had a huge effect. 3, after the first time it happens, then we look back and we come up with some sort of an explanation for it as though we could have expected it in the first place. So there was a Nobel Prize winner, 2 guys, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. One of them won the Nobel Prize in economics. And they have a term for this particular thing that we can describe it afterwards and and make up a reason for why it happened as though we could have expected. They call it post-decision surprise. Post-decision surprise. Okay. So that's what we've got. So what's the main idea here in black swan events? The main idea is that the objective isn't to predict black swan events. I guess we just can't do that. We're not even aware of them until after they happen. So it isn't to predict black swan events. It's to be prepared for black swan events. To do the things that we can do that would, hopefully at least, make sure that the supply chain or that our company recovers more quickly afterwards. That's called robustness. Robustness really means that if it happens, it doesn't affect us, or it doesn't affect us very much. Resilience is our ability to bounce back from having it affect us. Okay. So, last few sorts of ideas in this particular lecture would be that risk management, driven by significant failures due to reasons that range from deep ethical breaches. We saw those in the early 2000s and late 1990s in the U.S. So from deep ethical breaches to natural disasters, risk management has really exploded since the late 1990s. And some of those failures were so big that national governments enacted legislation aimed at increasing corporate transparency, especially with respect to how much risk that their investors or their stakeholders are exposed to. So in the U.S., we had in 2002, we had an act of Congress that was run through called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and it was after some specifically and spectacular corporate failures where investors were just devastated in their losses. Okay. And it was mostly because they had invested in companies and those companies were using their monies in ways that had extreme risk, and the investors didn't even know that. So now it's required, at least in the U.S. and in many nations around the world now, that companies are much more open about the risk that their investors are exposed to, and other key stakeholders as well. So risk management often addressed relative to enterprise processes. It can also be certainly be addressed with respect to the entire supply chain. It has at least 3 different systems. The first is that you have to have some sort of a system that enables you to identify significant risk to a process, to the supply chain itself. Considering it has a system that considers the likelihood that those risks actually happen or materialize. And you have a system that allows you to assess the impact of the consequences if those risks actually end up taking place. So exercise of due diligence across these systems can be facilitated by something called failure modes and effects analysis being adapted to supply chain risk. And there is a separate lecture, separate segment, that does exactly that in this lecture series. What about good corporate governance? Remember, that's the transparency issue. This is what Sarbanes-Oxley was about. So it addresses at least the following. So for your company, here's what you want out of your company if it's well governed. One, that it will protect the interest of stakeholders, the governance will. Two, the senior managers properly do their duties of risk management. Three, that there are safeguards or controls, as they're often called, around the continuing operations of the enterprise by developing appropriate risk management systems. It doesn't mean that everything is going to come up with rainbows and sunshine, but what it does mean is that you're doing your best to try to mitigate that risk. Identify, mitigate. It uses formal procedures to identify and analyze threats from risk. It forms and implements processes for dealing with risky events that actually do occur, and it mitigates their effects. Good governance monitors, reviews, and controls the whole risk management effort for the entire enterprise. And it ensures enterprise compliance, that the enterprise meets laws and regulations in the environments in which it operates. And then I do have a slide. We open this up by talking about terrorist threats to supply chains. Here's one slide that just mentions some of the risk that are involved, not only from terrorist threats, but it could be here. Loss of staff through death or injury. At the World Trade Center, I want to say that it was something like 2,300 deaths or maybe 3,200 deaths. More than 2,000 at least. Damage to buildings. You saw what happened with the World Trade Center with the Twin Towers. Loss of information technology systems. That's exactly what it is that we were talking about with respect to the Office of the Chief Technology Officer of the Government of Washington, D.C. and the work that went on there. Unavailability of staff because of disrupted transportation or their unwillingness to travel. Safety. So, for example, when the World Trade Center was bombed and the Pentagon was bombed, not really bombed, hit by airplanes, that was in September 11th, 2001. I was supposed to make a trip from, remember that I lived very close to the Pentagon, within a few minutes drive essentially, and worked within a few minutes drive. But I was supposed to make a trip just about 10 days later to France. Well, I couldn't even fly at that point. Could not even fly. Not because I wasn't willing, but because of the fallout of 9/11. And it was to a conference in France that I was responsible for founding the organization. I was the president of the organization that was holding that conference. So, I mean, that's an example. It's personal there. Now imagine if you're talking about a supply chain and they can't get their things through because of restrictions that are put on by governments and so on. Adverse psychological effects on staff, including stress and demoralization. Okay. Disruptions to related organizations and businesses that are necessary for operations can damage your reputation because all of a sudden you're not able to provide what it is that you have in the past. So there are a lot of potential impacts from terror threats or from terrorist attacks. And so this will give you just a little bit of insight, a little bit of things to think about in terms of risk management in the supply chain, risk and risk management in the supply chain. And I hope that you've picked up some things that are of interest to you. Thank you.